Okay. We are live. We don't have anybody watching us just yet, but I'm going to go ahead and do this. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the show tonight. This is a casual get-together to talk about, I need to work on my O's. This is a casual get-together to talk about Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. In the studio tonight, we have local filmmaker and SSU Professor Malinalli Lopez. She's a big fan of this film and has a lot of great ideas and thoughts about it. So without further ado, let's get her into the studio. Malinalli, welcome.
Hi.
It's so good to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's been so long. We were on another call this afternoon about diversity, equity, and inclusion, something that we're working on here at the Film Society. And what a perfect segue into this film. Molly, can you tell us a little bit about your history with the film and what it means to you?
Sure. So I just have to say that this is one of my most favorite films of all time. So this one and probably Boys in the Hood.
Ooh.
And I think because both of those films, I saw them. I didn't see them when they came out, but I saw them when I was a teenager, so in the 90s. And I think that these two films have always been in the back of my mind when I thought about becoming a filmmaker myself.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really critical. And I think for me, by now I have talked to many different people, especially my colleagues at Cinema State. And then also last year I had the opportunity to speak with Roger Guenveur-Smith, who plays the role of Smiley in the film.
Wait, okay, so tell me his name again.
Roger Guenveur-Smith.
And he plays Smiley.
Right, and Smiley's the photographer in the movie, and
he
carries the photographs of Malcolm X and MLK. So last year I had the opportunity to speak with him and again some of my colleagues, and one of the things that I learned is that everyone that I've talked to sees this film in a completely different way, right? I think that we're all connected in the sense that everyone understands this film to be a film about police brutality. It's so much more than that. You know, it has so many layers to it that it can be understood in many different ways. And it's not just about police brutality. You know, so for me as a young girl, when I first saw this film, for example, I think the lasting or most impressionable image for me was that 3-minute intro with Rosie Perez, you know, just dancing her butt off, right? You know, that was such an iconic image, you know, that resonated with me because first of all, she's an Afro-Latina. You know, I think a lot of people didn't read her as a Latina when they first see the film, but she's Puerto Rican, so she's Afro-Latina, and you know, it was a critical, you know, moment since I was again in my teenage years, and I think just the way that she's presented in the film, it had a lasting impact for me because I thought, oh well, what is this film teaching me? You know, it's teaching me that you have to be this like tough, assertive, aggressive, almost, you know, woman and stand by your man at the same time. And also be able to like, you know, have these fierce dance moves and have this like very curvy body, right? Like you have to be this ultimate package. So this is what I was getting out of the film the first time that I saw it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand how layered this film is, because then you have, you know, the role of Rosie Perez contrasted with the role of Mother Sister, who's a completely different type of female role in the film. And, you know, interesting to notice her very, you know, quick moment that she gets, you know, in the midst of the riot that's caused at the very end of the film. And I love what one of my colleagues at Sonoma State, Kim Hester Williams, has to say, which is that she lets out this guttural cry in the middle of the riot. And I think every Black person, every Latino person who has ever had a family member that has been aggressively dealt with, you know, through the police, understands that moment perfectly without any explanation or any dialogue. We understand that moment perfectly. So that's another layer of, you know, this story is you have these very different female characters and they participate in the neighborhood in very different ways. So that for me was a pivotal moment in time in understanding this film. And I think now as an adult, I go back and think, wow, like this film really had a lasting impact on my mind of what is police brutality? What does it mean to be a woman in this neighborhood, or what does it mean to be a woman in a community of color, in an African-American community as well. So one interesting question to ask of this movie for those of you that are tuning in is this film persuasive, and how is it persuasive to you? What is it trying to convince you of? And one of the things for me that was persuasive about this film is that I don't believe that this film has a protagonist. And actually, I had a debate with one of my colleagues at Sonoma State about this, because he believes that Spike Lee is the protagonist of this film through his character Mookie, but I don't believe that. I actually believe that the entire neighborhood is the protagonist of this movie, because if you look at all of them individually, they're pretty weak characters, but when you look at them collectively, they really are the strength of this film. So that's up for debate. I leave that to your opinion, but I think a good question to start in talking about this film is this film persuasive, and how so? What is it persuading us of? So what do you think about that, Catherine?
Well, Molly, now that you've asked, what I do, I want to just add a little bit of my own color to this. I just watched the movie for the first time, and I cannot believe that I had not seen it before. I was sure I had seen it. And I too, I was a huge Boys in the Hood fan, and I could have sworn I saw this movie, and I just finished it to discuss it with you tonight, and I am blown away. First of all, the visual storytelling that Spike Lee is employing back in the 80s, I mean, that's insane. This is my homage to Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing tonight. Or although I probably should be like up here and looking down into the camera. But, I think that's a really good question about the persuasiveness of it, because I will say that towards the end of the film, when Mookie is sitting on the curb, I thought, oh my God, this character is the observer. But quite to the contrary, he then becomes, he starts really moving the plot forward at that point with his act of protest. And I might have white people blinders on, but I did not think that I was being persuaded any one way except with that act of protest and the very meaningful, the dichotomy of quotes that he uses at the end, one about nonviolence and one about whatever it takes to make change, from Malcolm X.
Right.
So being persuaded that, if nothing else, I don't have the right answer. I don't have all the answers, and I can't possibly understand, because it's not my experience.
Because, really good art and really good film, what it does is that it changes, meaning with context, and then also just over time. And so I think for a lot of us, when we watch this film, even though I've watched it now probably at least 10 times, every time I watch it, there's a new meaning, and even more so this year because of all of the protests that we've been seeing unfold across the country. So even this year for me, watching it again is a different experience, because it really makes me question, how far do African Americans and how far do people of color have to go in order to show their humanity, and, to show that they're deserving of the same civil rights that everybody should enjoy. So it really brings up those questions for me, like, how far do you have to go? Which, then also makes me wonder, because, there has been so much debate over the years about, did Spike Lee, in his role of Mookie in the film, did he do the right thing when he threw that trash can through the window of Sal's Pizzeria? And that's been a question that has been debated quite hotly, over the years. Did he do the right thing in that moment, being Sal's employee and being of that neighborhood, and having the relationship that he did with Sal, but at the same time knowing that Radio Raheem had just died. So that's another question that this film brings up that I think is worthy of exploration and also a lot of discussion.
What do you think?
I think as a young girl, because I have to go back, in time, and I think as a young girl, my first impression was that both Sal and Mookie did the wrong thing. I feel like they both acted in ways that they should have never acted. And then I connected that back to the fact that part of the story is that it's supposed to be the hottest day of the year in New York City, where, this community is, a disenfranchised community. And I just thought both of these characters acted in a way that, maybe they repented later. But I think this year, my opinion has changed. And because I have been constantly asking myself this question, how far do people of color and African Americans have to go in order to show their humanity and to show that, that they are deserving of civil rights? And this year it shifted with the protests, because we have seen that immediately after so many protests that local legislators across the country are changing policy, and they are defunding the police in many cities, and that would not have happened without all of these protesters. And some of it brings out a very ugly side in people. Like, for example, we saw lots of young middle class white protesters being very destructive. So that was part of it too. But again, I really feel in the deepest part of my heart that had these protests not happened, we would not be seeing all of these changes in policy, which to me has really been eye-opening, because I was always on, the side of, civil rights from a peaceful standpoint. So my lens, I think, has really changed over time.
So are you willing to say plainly that you see, understand, or even condone where Mookie was coming from in the film?
That's such an interesting question, because I actually listened to an interview with Spike Lee about that question, and something really fascinating, which is that no person of color or African American has ever asked him if Mookie was doing the right thing when he threw that trash can. And I think he's right, because I want to go back to my point that if you've had a family member that experienced a situation of police brutality, or maybe they were incarcerated, or they were arrested, or had any sort of interaction, with the police in that way, that you don't question it, you just understand it, and you don't have to explain it. Yeah. And he said only white people have ever asked him, did Mookie do the right thing when he threw that trash can? Because he did a lot of interviews, obviously, in the aftermath of the film. And he said only white people didn't understand why Mookie threw that trash can. And I think, again, I also want to connect that back to my earlier point of mother, sister, having this guttural cry in the midst of the riot. And I think because sometimes what happens if you're a person of color is you reach this breaking point where you're at a loss and you do not have words anymore, and you're just in a rage. So I interpret her cry as this like silent rage that has been building up, and that's what she does in that moment. For Mookie, I think that silent rage, that breaks out of him is throwing that trash can. And again, in discussions with people of color, I don't think you have to explain that too much. We just understand, because sometimes we experience things in our skin and in being who we are that you just can't explain. They're just enraging, and you think, why? Why in this country that's supposed to be built on, all of these ideals of democracy and justice for all, and all of the values that we have, and yet it's not true for us. So it does bring us to this point of rage sometimes.
Two things on that, Molly. I was struck in the film. How old was Spike Lee when he made this? 20?
23, maybe.
3, 4? Yeah. I was really struck in the film how he created, not only visually, which was quite stunning. But momentum wise in the narrative, he created a boiling point so furious, not angry furious, but just so intense.
Right.
It had nowhere to go but explode. Right. And some of the reviews I've read of this film have pointed out that it's so stimulating, it's hard to watch. Like there's people are at a fever pitch for almost 2 hours.
Right.
But I think that I'm going to give him credit on that and expect that was intentional because it was really effective.
Right.
And the other thing that I want to point out, subpoint A actually, the use of water in this film is fascinating. How the community gathers around, they do something naughty and gather around the fire hydrant, and it's a moment of blissful release for people and joy, and how that same water gets turned on them as a people and as a community at the end. And something that really, what you just said about rage, recently watched I Am Not Your Negro. I had not seen that either. Mm-hmm. And I think it was, I can't remember who said it, but the black man is full of rage and the white man is full of fear, and with each other, and that's how it comes to explode in that way. That was really, I thought that was very telling as well. But what is something else? How about one more point, one more question that you find so interesting about all this?
Well, I think, my last point perhaps is something you brought up, which is that it ends with these quotes from Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But I think that their roles have also been misinterpreted in a sense, because I think that they were more alike than they were different. So I think that the presentation of them has been really skewed in the little history that we get, here in the U.S. From K through 12 on really what their roles were. Like, for example, I think MLK was more of a rebel visionary than people give him credit for. And I think Malcolm X wanted peace, more than people give him credit for. So I think that they were more alike than different, and I think that somehow gets misrepresented. Not in this film, but I think just in general. So when people watch this film and they see the references to MLK and Malcolm X, I think it's out of context a little bit, because I think that they were, again, more alike than different. And this also makes me remember a quote from Malcolm X. It's my favorite quote from him, which is not in the film, but it's my favorite one because I think it's the most accurate one that he's ever said, which is that racism is like a Cadillac. They make a new model every year. So the last point I wanted to leave everyone with is that this film came out 31 years ago. So 31 years ago, and we're still debating police brutality. I wouldn't say that the quality of life for people of color and also African Americans has changed very much in 31 years. We're still talking about the very same issues, that have to do with gender, class, and race. And I think that, the final thing I will say is that this film was very prophetic in that sense, is that, it foretold us like what the experience was, what the relationship was if you are from a poor community or a low-income community, and how you are placed in the world, how people view you in the world, because again, clearly we're talking about the same issues. And, there have been activists. And for example, in the book, The New Jim Crow, there has also been an exploration of how the mass incarceration system has evolved, and that now the new slavery is, the immigration and detention centers, house arrests. So instead of being in jail, like in a physical jail, there's often immigrants who are at home that are wearing ankle bracelets, for doing nothing more than, crossing the border. So I think that these are all systems that we need to take a deeper look at and look at, work of, the Spike Lees of the world and see what they're telling us, And I think that the clearest message that they're telling us is that when a community is unified, they can solve so much, but when an institution that's racist, like let's say, for example, in this situation, it's the police, drives a wedge to divide that community, then it does become a problem and it becomes very tense, as we see in this movie. So I think often, filmmakers are very exciting in that way because they're telling us, not just what is, but what will happen as well.
Yeah. And you know what else, Molly? I think there's something to the institutionalization of racism that the three fellows against the red brick wall,
yes,
are talking about. And they get one of them gets really bothered by the Korean deli.
Yes.
And without saying it overtly, clearly they have not been able to open businesses in their own neighborhoods, not having the capital or the leg up that it takes to be able to start something like that. And yet, and the tension when the Korean family at the end says, I'm Black.
Right. I thought that was such an interesting line because the thing that I immediately thought when I heard that line is, first of all, New York City is built over native land. So that's the first thing. And then, the second sort of iteration of, I would say, genocide is slavery. So slavery also was part of the institution, that was, the experience of Africans who were brought over, right? So this neighborhood is built on, those sites of conquest and of colonialism. So I think for me, I immediately understood that line to be, from these three men that we're not all the same, because look at our legacy, look at what we come from, right? So we're not the same. So it's sort of a disintegration of the American dream, really, because you have to look at, the history of people and where do they come from.
Yeah. This is an interesting time. I'm really glad that you and I are friends, and I'm glad that we're colleagues and that we can tackle some of this stuff together. Mm-hmm. I think that the only way it changes is really understanding, dialogue, learning, understanding. Not everybody is curious, and that's where I do think that throwing a garbage can through a window comes into play, because we do have people who will not get it otherwise.
Right.
Not that I condone violence, but I understand it.
Right. Yeah, and I think from the lens of a person of color, I think the way we understand that moment is the first violence that happened to us. So anything that happens in the aftermath of that is really our defense mechanisms kicking in.
I thought that's exactly what that trash can moment was about.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There is nothing that I can do to you that is the equal of that.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I bring up this whole idea that, this neighborhood is built over Native American land that's built on the same location where slaves were held by slave owners, because, the first violation was, to the bodies of our ancestors. That happened first. And like I said, anything in the aftermath of that is so small. It's not nearly on an equal level as the violence that happened before us.
Molly, I have one last question for you before we wrap up. For anybody who's watching us, I mentioned this earlier, the Film Society has taken the step of beginning our personal audit, our organizational audit, from systems, processes, hiring, programming, of systemic, institutionalized, implicit bias, overt racism. And we've invited a few new community members in to help us get the work started. And Molly was on the call with us today. and we talked about the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And Molly, would you mind sharing your thoughts from earlier today on that? I was not surprised to hear what you said,
Right.
but I felt it was very instructive. Would you mind sharing?
Sure. So I find this label really interesting, for starters, and it's something I recently learned of. And what I was saying is, for me, the label is not as important as the dialogue behind it. So I think that that's most important, because when you talk to communities of color, it's important to understand what it is that they like to be called, and have a discussion about that, and truly listen to what they're saying. Because, for example, for some time now, there has been this term Latinx that has been floating around everywhere, right? And I think that, people that are, millennials and even younger, on many levels have embraced this term. But I think for me, because I'm a little bit more old school now, and I think for me, it's really important to be recognized as somebody who is Mexican, somebody who is a Chicana. And those are the terms that I really embrace, because they mean something to me, and they mean something to me in relation to my history. And it's also most important because, my relatives, that's what they call themselves. And in the many conversations I've had with my friends, they call themselves Chicana or Chicano. And to me, it's also a deep connection to the Chicano movement. And for whatever reason, I've noticed that over time, when I say I'm a Chicana or Mexican, there seems to be very frequently almost an allergic reaction, most especially from white people, because for whatever reason, they cannot bring themselves to say those words. Like, they prefer Latino, Hispanic, really anything that's not Mexican, and I think it's because it's really out of convenience, just to lump everything together,
Right.
to lump Puerto Ricans, to lump Colombians, Cubans, Mexicans all together, but we're not all the same thing. We're very different cultures. Sometimes we speak very different styles of Spanish. We're not all the same thing. So for me, when you say that I'm Mexican or that I'm Chicana, it automatically invokes a very specific history for me. So I don't understand this like allergic reaction to those terms, and the preference of Latino, because California was Mexico, before it was ever California. The Southwest of the U.S. was Mexico before it was ever the U.S. Southwest. So for me, it's so important to have these dialogues and to not just reference labels, but to understand, the history behind it, to understand the dialogues that people are engaging in and how they want to be known in the world.
So I'm codifying that into a comment. The dialogue and history behind a label is more important than the label itself.
Right. Because, to be honest, I respect young people that want to be called Latinx, because I understand it, and I understand their focus on, being gender inclusive. So I completely understand that. But for me, it's very important these labels, or these identities of Chicana and Mexican, because for me, they honor like my indigenous roots. And that's what I mean, is that every word has a whole history behind it. So it's very important to understand the history behind any word. It doesn't just have to be any of these labels, but just any word.
Wow, that's great. Molly, thank you so much for hopping online with us and just chatting about this for a little bit. I hope that this is super casual. It went across our social media. It'll live on social media, and people will be able to, find it and check in and hear a little bit about the film, your thoughts on the film. And I hope that we can do this again. I think we should make it a regular occurrence. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. This was so much fun, and it's always fun to share what I'm working on. I've also written an article about Do the Right Thing that was published in a magazine, Safandi. So I'll send you that link. But it talks all about the impact of Rosie Perez and why it's so important to understand her as a Puerto Rican woman and as a Latina in this movie.
please do. And I'll put that in the comments of each of the social media files. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great night.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye. And thank you for those of you who tuned in with us tonight. Again, a super casual chat on a Wednesday. By the way, thank you to our sponsors tonight. We have Mike Finelli to thank of Healdsburg Sotheby's. We also have Crew S Wines that I think poured wine for several of you, Pizzeria, and Papa's Pizza here in Cloverdale. My name is Catherine Hecht. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Valley Film Society, signing off from my home in Cloverdale, wishing you all a peaceful good night.